The Ides of March 44 BC. The marble floors of the theatre of Pompey ran crimson with the blood of Rome's most powerful man. 23 wounds pierced the body of Gaius Julius Caesar, each delivered by senators who believed they were saving the Republic, elles form les CR. But as Caesars lefumpled at the base of Pompey's statue, these conspirators had no idea they had just signed their own death warrants. What followed was not the restoration of Roman liberty they had dreamed of, but a systematic hunt that would claim every single one of them. Some would die by their own swords, others would be hunted down like animals, and a few would meet ends so gruesome that even hardened Roman soldiers would turn away in disgust. This is extractigence upon those who the story of how Rome its vended strike down Caesar, and how every conspirator paid the ultimate price for their betrayal. The conspiracy that ended Caesar's life was not born overnight for months. It festered in the shadows of the Roman Senate, fueled by jealousy, ambition, and genuine ani. These fear of Tyre men convinced themselves they were heroes, liberators, who would restore the glory of the Republic. They could not have been more wrong about what their actions would unleash upon the world. Leading this band of would-be saviors was Marcus Junius Brutus, the man whose very name would become synonymous with betrayal. Brutus came from a family with a proud tradition of opposing tyrants, and Caesar had elevated him to positions of honor and trust. The dictator treated him almost like a son, which made his participation in the plot all the more shocking. When Caesar's eyes met those of Brutus during those final moments, the look of betrayal cut deeper than any blade. But Brutus was not alone in his treachery. Standing beside him was Gaius Cassius Longinus, a man whose hatred for Caesar burned with personal fury. Cassius had once supported Caesar, but jealousy and slights, both real and imagined, had turned him into the dictator's most determined enemy. He had been passed over for military commands, his property had been seized, and rumors swirled that Caesar had carried on an affair with his wife. Every insult had added fuel to the fire of his resentment until it consumed all reason. The conspiracy was Decimus Junius grew to include over 60 senators, each bringing their own grievances against Caesar. There, Brutus Albinus, Caesar's trusted lieutenant, who had fought beside him in Gaul but felt inadequately rewarded for his loyalty. Gaius Trebonius, whose ambition exceeded even his considerable talents, had been among the first to join the plot. The brothers Servilius and Gaius Casca prepared to strike the first and second blows. Each conspirator believed they were acting for Rome, but they were actually sealing their own doom. The assassination itself was a masterpiece of coordination and brutality. On that fateful morning, Caesar had been warned by soothsayers to beware the Ides of March. His wife Calpurnia had suffered nightmares and begged him not to attend the Senate meeting. Even as he walked toward the theatre of Pompey, a desperate citizen thrust a scroll into his hands warning of the plot. Caesar never read it. Decimus Brutus, exploiting his position as Caesar's trusted friend, had convinced him to attend the Senate session. As Caesar took the dictator to ignore these on his seat, the conspirators surrounded him under the pretense of presenting a petition. Tilius Cimber grabbed Caesar's toga and yanked it down from his shoulders, the signal for the attack to begin. Servilius Casca struck first, aiming for Caesar's throat, but hitting his chest instead. Caesar fought back, grabbing Casca's arm and crying out in Latin, demanding to know what the villain was doing. But then, the others closed in, like a pack of wolves. 3 wounds. Swords flashed in the morning light as 20 opened across Caesar's body. The great dictator who had conquered Gaul and crossed the Rubicon fell bleeding at the base of a statue erected to honor his former rival, Pompey. In those chaotic moments after the assassination, the conspirators believed they had achieved something glorious. They marched through Rome with their bloody daggers raised high, shouting that Brutus addressed the crowd, explaining they had liberated the city from tyranny, their noble intentions, and expecting to be hailed as heroes. Instead, they were met with stunned silence, and growing anger from the Roman people. The conspirators had fatally miscalculated the mood of Rome. Caesar was beloved by the common citizens who had benefited from his generous policies and public works. The veterans who had served under him in Gaul remembered his courage and leadership on the battlefield. Rather than celebrating the restoration of the Republic, the people's vengeance for their of Rome began to demand fallen leader. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant and co-consul, quickly seized control of the situation. At Caesar's funeral, he delivered a masterful speech that turned public opinion completely against the assassins. He read Caesar's will aloud, revealing generous bequests to the Roman people and the dedication of his private gardens for public use. When Antony displayed Caesar's blood-stained toga and pointed to each rent made by the conspirators' daggers, the crowd erupted in fury. The conspirators suddenly found themselves transformed from liberators into hunted criminals. Mobs roamed the streets of, and the assassins roamed seeking revenge. Ins were forced to barricade themselves in their homes or flee the city entirely. Their moment of triumph had lasted mere hours before turning into a nightmare of pursuit and fear. But the real architect of their destruction was not the Roman mob, but a young man whom most of the conspirators had dismissed as insignificant. Gaius Octavius, Caesar's 18-year-old grandnephew and adopted heir, had been studying in Greece when news of the assassination reached him. Against the advice of his friends and family, Octavius immediately set sail for Italy to claim his inheritance and avenge his adopted father. The youth who would one day become Augustus Caesar possessed a political cunning that belied his years. He understood that the conspirators had not just murdered Caesar, but had torn apart the very fabric of Roman society. The republic they claimed to defend was already dying, and their actions had simply accelerated its collapse. In the chaos that followed, only the strongest and most ruthless would survive. Octavius allied himself with Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus, forming the second triumvirate and dividing power between them. Their first act was to publish proscription lists, death warrants for their enemies that included bounties for their heads. Every conspirator's name appeared on these lists, marking them for death wherever they might flee. The hunt had begun, and there would be no mercy for Caesar's killers. Some would attempt to raise armies and fight back. Others would try to dissap corners of the empire, and a few heir into the far would choose to end their own lives rather than face capture. But none would escape the vengeance that Rome demanded for the murder of its greatest son. The conspirators had believed they were writing themselves into history as heroes and liberators. Instead, they had authored their own death sentences in Caesar's blood. The republic they died trying to save would perish with them, replaced by an empire that would endure for centuries. Their names would be remembered not as saviors, but as cautionary tales about the price of betraying Rome's anointed leader. The systematic extermination of Caesar's assassins began almost immediately, but it would unfold over more than a decade of blood and betrayal. Each conspirator would meet their end in ways that seemed almost designed by the gods themselves to match their crimes. Some deaths came swiftly on the battlefield, others arrived slowly through years of exile and desperation, but all would serve as testament to the terrible price of striking down Rome's chosen leader. Marcus Junius Brutus, the most famous of the conspirators, would discover that his noble ancestry and philosophical ideals offered no protection against the fury he had unleashed. After Caesar's assassination, Brutus initially remained in Rome, attempting to justify his actions to an increasingly hostile population. He delivered speeches in the Forum, explaining how the murder had been necessary to preserve Roman liberty. But his words fell on deaf ears as the people demanded justice for their fallen champion. Forced to flee the city he claimed to have saved, Brutus travelled east to gather support among Rome's provincial governors, philosophical lectures, and trying to convince himself. He spent months in Athens, attending that history would vindicate his actions. But even as he studied the writings of ancient Greeks about tyranny and freedom, armies were being raised against him. The young Octavius had not forgotten the man who had betrayed his adoptive father's trust. Brutus attempted to raise funds and soldiers in the eastern provinces, even going so far as to mint his own coins bearing the image of daggers and the date of Caesar's assassination. These coins, intended to celebrate his deed, instead served as wanted posters announcing his location to his enemies. Every piece of silver he spent carried the message of his guilt across the Mediterranean world. The end came for Brutus at Philippi in 42 BC, where he faced the combined forces of Octavius and Mark Antony. The battle was brutal and decisive, with Brutus watching helplessly as his forces crumbled under the assault of veteran legions loyal to Caesar's memory. When defeat became inevitable, Brutus chose the Roman way of avoiding capture. He fell upon his own sword, dying with Caesar's name upon his lips and the weight of his betrayal crushing his final breath. Gaius Cassius Longinus, the man whose personal hatred had helped drive the conspiracy forward, met an equally fitting end at the same battle. Cassius had been the practical mastermind behind much of the plot, using his knowledge of Caesar's habits and routines to plan the perfect assassination. His jealousy and wounded pride had made him the perfect recruiter for other disaffected senators who felt overlooked or slighted by the dictator. But Cassius's military skills, which had once served Rome well in distant campaigns, proved insufficient against the forces arrayed against him at Philippi. When he saw Brutus's forces being overwhelmed, despair consumed him entirely. Rather than face the humiliation of capture and execution, Cassius ordered his freedmen to decapitate him with the same sword he had once plunged into Caesar's body. His head was severed from his shoulders, a grotesque ending for a man who had helped orchestrate one of history's most infamous murders. Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, Caesar's former trusted lieutenant, and perhaps the most personally treacherous of all the conspirators, would suffer a death that matched his betrayal in its cruelty. After the assassination, Decimus had initially tried to maintain his position in Rome, but the growing hostility forced him to flee northward. He attempted to disguise himself as a Gallic tribesman, hoping his years of campaigning in Gaul would help him blend in among the barbarian tribes. His desperate masquerade failed completely. Mark Antony had placed substantial bounties on the heads of all the conspirators, and local chieftains were eager to collect these rewards. Decimus was betrayed by the very people he had once helped Caesar conquer, handed over to Roman agents who recognized him despite his crude disguise. His head was severed and sent to Rome as proof of his death, ending the life of a man who had repaid Caesar's trust with steel and treachery. The Casca brothers, Servilius and Gaius, who had struck the first and second blows against Caesar, would die together as they had conspired together. These men had been among the most eager participants in the assassination, with Servilius earning the distinction of drawing first blood from Caesar's body. Their enthusiasm for violence against their leader would be matched only by their cowardice when facing the consequences of their actions. Both brothers survived long enough to fight at Philippi, but when the battle turned against them, neither possessed the courage to face capture and interrogation. They chose suicide over the possibility of being dragged through Rome in chains, falling on their swords in a final act that was more desperation than honor. Their deaths eliminated two of the most violent participants in Caesar's murder dictator's blood. Gaius, closing a chapter of betrayal written in the Trebonius, whose ambition had made him one of the earliest conspirators, would discover that his dreams of power led only to a nightmare of pursuit and terror. After Caesar's death, Trebonius had managed to secure an appointment as governor of Asia, thinking distance from Rome might provide safety from the growing storm of vengeance. He established himself in the wealthy province, attempting to build a power base that might protect him from his enemies. But Trebonius had made the fatal error of denying entry to his province to Publius Cornelius Dolabella, a former supporter of Caesar who had turned against the conspirators. Dolabella was not a man who accepted rejection gracefully, especially from someone who had participated in murdering his former commander. He gathered his forces and laid siege to Trebonius's stronghold, determined to extract revenge for Caesar's death. When Dolabella finally captured Trebonius, the end was swift and brutal. The conspirator was dragged from his bed and executed without ceremony, his head severed from his body as payment for his role in Caesar's assassination. But Dolabella's soldiers, drunk on victory and bloodlust, were not satisfied with mere execution. They took Trebonius's head and used it as a ball, kicking it through the streets until it was nothing more than a pulverized mass of flesh and bone. Tilius Cimber, who had provided the signal for the attack by grabbing Caesar's toga, would face divine justice for his sacrilege against the gods themselves. After fleeing Rome, Cimber had allied himself with Mark Antony, hoping that switching sides might save his life. He served in Antony's fleet and even helped construct warships for the coming conflict with Octavius. During this service, Cimber made a terrible mistake that would seal his fate. While gathering timber for Antony's ships, he ordered the cutting down of trees from what was considered deeply blasphemous by the Romans, who believed it were a grove sacred to Aesculapius, the god of healing. The Actidi bring divine punishment upon anyone who violated sacred spaces. When Octavius finally defeated Antony at the Battle of Actium, he ordered that Cimber be executed in the very grove he had desecrated, allowing the god to claim his vengeance for the double crime of sacrilege and treason. Lucius Cornelius Cinna, whose relationship to Caesar through marriage had made his betrayal particularly stinging, would face the mob justice of Rome itself. Cinna had been among the most vocal opponents of Caesar in the Senate, delivering fiery speeches against the dictator's policies and person. His hatred had been intensely personal, fueled by jealousy and political ambition that Caesar's rise had frustrated. After the assassination, Cinna continued his inflammatory rhetoric, giving speeches that attempted to justify the murder and rally support for the conspirators' cause. But his words only served to inflame the Roman people further against Caesar's killers. When mobs began hunting for the assassins in the streets of Rome, they specifically sought out Cinna for his role in inciting hatred against their beloved leader. The mob's fury was so intense that they killed the wrong man entirely, mistaking the poet Helvius Cinna for the conspirator and tearing him apart in the streets. The real Cinna managed to escape this immediate vengeance, but his survival would prove temporary. He spent years in hiding and exile, watching as his fellow conspirators fell one by one to the systematic hunt that had been launched against them. Death came for him eventually, though the exact circumstances of his end remain shrouded in the shadows of history. These deaths were not random acts of violence or the simple fortunes of war. They represented something far more significant in the Roman understanding of justice and divine will. Each conspirator's demise seemed to reflect the nature of his crime, as if the gods themselves were ensuring that the punishment matched the betrayal. Those who had struck Caesar in person died by the sword. Those who had desecrated sacred bonds faced divine retribution, and those who had fled in cowardice were hunted down like the animals they had become. The message was clear to all who witnessed these systematic executions. Rome would not tolerate the murder of its chosen leaders, and those who raised their hands against Caesar's legacy would pay with their lives. The republic the conspirators had died trying to save was transforming into something new and terrible, an empire that would endure for centuries precisely because it understood the price of betrayal. The surviving conspirators watched in growing terror as their fellow assassins fell one by one, each death a grim reminder that nowhere in the Roman world was safe from the vengeance that pursued them. Those who remained alive began to understand that Caesar's murder had not been an act of liberation, but a crime that had awakened something ancient and implacable in the Roman soul. Quintus Ligarius discovered that gratitude was a double-edged sword that could cut both ways. This man had once been Caesar's enemy, fighting against him in support of Pompey during the civil wars that had torn Rome apart. When defeat came, Ligarius faced exile and disgrace, his political career seemingly ended by his choice of the losing side. But Caesar, in a display of the mercy that had made him beloved, had pardoned Ligarius and allowed him to return to Rome. Rather than feeling grateful for this unexpected clemency, Ligarius had nursed his resentment like a poisonous wound. He could not forgive Caesar for having the power to spare or destroy him, for holding his very life in his hands like a plaything. The pardon that should have earned Caesar loyalty instead bred deeper hatred, as Ligarius saw in it a reminder of his own humiliation and dependence. When Brutus approached him about joining the conspiracy, Ligarius embraced the opportunity with savage enthusiasm. Here was his chance to strike back at the man who had shown him mercy, to prove that he was nobody's grateful dog begging for scraps from the master's table. His participation in the plot was driven not by noble ideals about the Republic, but by the bitter pride of a man who preferred death to obligation. The manner of Ligarius's end remains lost to history, swallowed by the chaos that engulfed Rome in the years following Caesar's assassination. Some accounts suggest he died at Philippi alongside Brutus and Cassius, while others hint at a more private demise, alone and forgotten in some distant corner of the empire. Perhaps the obscurity of his death was itself a form of justice, denying him even the dignity of a memorable end. Publius Servilius Casca Longus, the elder of the Casca brothers, had earned his place in infamy by striking the first blow against Caesar. His attack had been clumsy and poorly aimed, missing Caesar's throat and instead opening a wound across his chest. But that failed strike had broken the spell of Caesar's invincibility, showing the other conspirators that their target was mortal flesh rather than divine marble. In the months before his death at Philippi, Casca had briefly held the position of tribune of the plebs, using his office to rally support for the conspirators' cause. He delivered speeches in the Forum, attempting to convince the Roman people that Caesar's murder had been necessary to preserve their freedoms. But his words rang hollow to citizens who remembered Caesar's generosity and victories, and Casca found himself increasingly isolated, even among his fellow senators. When the final battle came, Casca fought with the desperate courage of a man who knew that capture meant torture and disgrace. Roman soldiers who faced him at Philippi later recalled his wild-eyed ferocity, as if he were trying to hack his way through the entire army to reach some impossible redemption. But courage born of desperation could not overcome the disciplined fury of Caesar's veterans, and Casca fell with his brother beside him, their blood mingling on the battlefield where their hopes of republican restoration died forever. Minucius Basileus carried with him the shame of the most humiliating moment in the entire assassination. When the conspirators had surrounded Caesar and begun their deadly work, Minucius had struck with such poor aim that he missed the dictator entirely, instead wounding his fellow conspirator, Rubrius Ruga. The error had been witnessed by dozens of senators and would be recorded by historians as evidence of either divine protection of Caesar or the cosmic justice that turned the conspirators' weapons against each other. This man had served under Caesar in Gaul, participating in the conquest that had made Rome master of Western Europe. He had witnessed Caesar's military genius firsthand, watching the general turn impossible situations into crushing victories through sheer audacity and tactical brilliance. Yet somehow Minucius had convinced himself that the same leader who had outmaneuvered Germanic tribes and Gallic warriors could be safely betrayed by his own officers. His service in Gaul had also earned him Caesar's disappointment when he failed to capture the rebel chieftain Ambiorix, allowing a dangerous enemy to escape and continue his resistance. The memory of Caesar's cold displeasure at this failure had festered in Minucius's mind, transforming professional disappointment into personal hatred. He had joined the conspiracy partly to prove that he was not the incompetent soldier to demonstrate his inadequacy in the most Caesar believed him to be, only public way possible. The end came for Minucius at the hands of his own slaves, men he had been torturing as punishment for various infractions. These brutalized servants, seeing their master's weakness as news of the conspirators' defeats reached Rome, turned on him with the fury of the oppressed, finally given their chance for revenge. They cut him down in his own home, his screams echoing through chambers where he had inflicted similar agonies on others. The slaves who killed him were later executed for their crime, but not before they had delivered a form of justice that seemed almost divinely ordained. Pontius Aquila had distinguished himself among the conspirators by the sheer intensity of his personal hatred for Caesar. This man had once refused to stand when Caesar received public honors, a breach of protocol so severe that it had become a matter of public scandal. Caesar, demonstrating the wit that had made him as dangerous with words as with swords, had responded to this insult with a campaign of verbal time. Caesar made a public promise or announcement, he'd torture that lasted for days. Every would add the mocking qualifier, that is, if Pontius Aquila permits it. The phrase became a running joke throughout Rome, with citizens repeating it in markets and taverns as they conducted their daily business. For Aquila, this public humiliation was worse than any physical beating, transforming him into a laughingstock whose very name became synonymous with imp opportunity, came to join the conspiracy against otent rage. When the Caesar, Aquila had embraced it with the fervour of a man seeking to wash away years of accumulated shame with blood. He believed that participating in Caesar's murder would restore his dignity and prove that he was not the powerless fool Caesar had made him appear. Instead, his involvement only confirmed his status as a man driven by petty grievances rather than noble principles. After Caesar's death, Aquila had initially allied himself with Mark Antony, perhaps hoping that switching sides might earn him protection from the growing storm of vengeance. But Antony had no use for men whose loyalty could be so easily purchased, and when the time came for hard fighting, Aquila found himself abandoned by his supposed protector. He cut down by soldiers who cared nothing for his grievances against Caesar, or his desperate attempts to find safety in changing allegiances. The systematic destruction of Caesar's assassins sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world that extended far beyond the immediate participants in the plot. Provincial governors who had remained neutral found themselves forced to choose sides as the triumvirs demanded absolute loyalty. Senators who had merely supported the conspiracy in principle discovered that passive approval was treated the same as active participation. Cassius Parmensis, the last of the conspirators to die, would spend 13 years running from the consequences of that March morning in 44 BC. This man had distinguished himself not only as a participant in Caesar's murder, but as a poet and playwright, whose works were performed throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. His literary talents had earned him connections across the Greek-speaking world, and he used these networks to stay one step ahead of his pursuers for over a decade. Parmensis had also gained notoriety for penning what may have been history's first recorded insult directed at someone's mother, taunting the young Octavius about his grandmother's humble origins as a baker's daughter. The crude verse had circulated throughout Rome, providing ammunition for those who questioned the legitimacy of Caesar's heir. But words that seemed clever in the moment would prove to be yet another nail in Parmensis' coffin, when Octavius finally gained the power to settle all old scores. During his years of exile, Parmensis had attached himself to various anti-triumvir factions, writing propaganda pieces and dramatic works that portrayed Caesar as a tyrant and his killers as heroes. His plays, with titles like Brutus and Ides, were performed in cities across Greece and Asia Minor, keeping alive the narrative that the conspirators had been noble republicans fighting against despotism. But artistic talent provided no protection against political reality, and when Sextus Pompey was finally defeated at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Parmensis found himself without protectors or hiding places. Octavius, now calling himself Augustus and master of the Roman world, had not forgotten the poet who had mocked his family and celebrated his adoptive father's murder. The execution that followed was swift and final, bringing to an end the last voice that had dared to defend Caesar's assassins. The deaths of these men represented more than simple revenge or political necessity. They marked the transformation of Rome itself from a republic where senators could challenge their leaders into an empire where opposition to the emperor meant death. Each execution strengthened the principle that would guide Roman politics for centuries to come. The person of the ruler was sacred, and those who violated that sanctity would pay with their lives. The conspirators had believed they were defending ancient Roman values against the innovations of a would-be king. Instead, their actions had accelerated the very transformation they feared, proving that the old republic was too weak to survive the ambitions of great men. The empire that rose from its ashes would be built on the lesson written in their blood, that power in Rome belonged to those strong enough to seize it and ruthless enough to hold it. As the last conspirator fell, the Roman world had learned a lesson that would echo through the centuries. Caesar's murder had not preserved the republic, but had instead birthed something new and terrible, an imperial system that would spread Roman law and Roman values across 3 continents while crushing anyone who dared challenge its authority. The men who killed Caesar believing they were saving Rome had instead created the very thing they feared most, an empire where one man's word was law and opposition meant death. The message was unmistakable, carved in blood across the marble of Roman history. Every senator who had dared raise a blade against Caesar lay dead, their names becoming cautionary tales whispered in the shadows of the Forum. Yet their deaths accomplished something far more profound than mere vengeance. They had transformed Rome itself, burning away the last government and forging in its place a pretense of republican empire that would endure for 1,000 years. The psychological impact on Roman society was immediate and overwhelming. Senators who had once debated freely in the Forum now measured every word, knowing that criticism of the wrong person could lead to prescription lists and execution squads. The casual violence that had characterized late Republican politics gave way to a more calculated brutality, where opposition was crushed with systematic precision rather than spontaneous passion. Citizens throughout the empire watched in fascination and terror as the most powerful men in Rome fell one by one. Provincial governors who had maintained careful neutrality suddenly found themselves forced to declare absolute loyalty to the triumvirs or face the same fate as the conspirators. The message spread across every corner of the Mediterranean world. Rome had changed, and those who failed to adapt would be swept away by forces beyond their comprehension. The transformation extended even to the physical landscape of the city itself. Statues of the conspirators were torn down by angry mobs, their bronze and marble repurposed for monuments celebrating Caesar's memory and his heirs' victories. The theatre of Pompey, where Caesar had bled to death, became a shrine of sorts, drawing crowds who came to witness the spot where the Republic had truly ended. Graffiti appeared on walls throughout the city, some mourning the dead dictator, others celebrating his killer's destruction. In the provinces, the systematic elimination of Caesar's murderers served as a masterclass in imperial power projection. Local rulers and client kings understood that Rome's reach extended everywhere, that no corner of the known world offered sanctuary from imperial justice. The message was reinforced by the display of severed heads sent from distant battlefields, grim trophies that demonstrated the futility of opposing Rome's chosen leaders. The blood-soaked stones of the theatre of Pompey had witnessed the birth of an empire, though the men who spilled that blood never understood what they were creating. Every conspirator who struck down Caesar believing themselves liberators had instead forged the chains of imperial rule that would bind Rome for generations. Their deaths served as the foundation upon which Augustus built his throne, each execution a nail driven into the coffin of republican government. The lesson carved in their flesh echoed through history. Those who challenge Rome's anointed rulers will face consequences that extend beyond death itself, becoming cautionary tales whispered in the shadows of power for centuries to come.